My name is John Gravely. I'm an environmental health researcher. Today I will be talking to you at the State Department about the concerning issue of cardiovascular disease and the way in which genes and the environment affects this. I hope together we can find a way to decrease the number of cases we have seen in recent years. Even one case is too many. In this presentation, I will be discussing a variety of issues on how the genes and environmental interactions affect cardiovascular disease. To start off, here's a quick look into the things that I feel are important when discussing the issue of cardiovascular disease. First, I will talk about what cardiovascular disease is and why is it important for you to care about. Second, I'll be talking about some environmental factors that are harmful and associated with cardiovascular disease. I will also be discussing genetic factors that make one susceptible more so than others to cardiovascular disease. And lastly, some things that the individual does that puts them at greater risk for cardiovascular disease in general. My hope in highlighting these issues is that we can come up with a way to limit these exposures and risks and decrease the number of cases that we see with cardiovascular disease in the future. Here are some quick facts about heart disease. As you may or may not know, heart disease is a leading cause of death worldwide. These deaths can be partially prevented, and with education and lifestyle changes, can be greatly reduced. The heart, as we all know, is an important part of the human body. Cardiovascular disease does not care who you are or what you look like. It kills everyone the same. The most common cause of cardiovascular disease is coronary heart disease. As you can see here in this slide, in America, there are roughly 740,000 people affected by heart attacks every year. On this slide, you can see some important statistics. For instance, in the United States, someone has a heart attack every 40 seconds. Each minute, more than one person in the United States dies from a heart disease related event. Also, in the United States, we spend about 200 billion each year on heart disease. Some other important statistics is that over 400 million men and women have a kind of cardiovascular illness. And lastly, before moving on, 1 out of every 3 of all global deaths are the result of heart disease and stroke. The term heart disease is often used interchangeably with the term cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease generally refers to conditions that involve narrowed or blocked blood vessels that can lead to a heart attack, chest pain, or strokes. Other heart conditions, such as those that affect your heart's muscles, valves, or rhythm, are also considered forms of heart disease. So as we look further into cardiovascular disease, we just talked on the previous slide that cardiovascular disease is also known as heart disease. So what is heart disease? Heart disease is when plaque builds up in the arteries and causes these arteries to slow the flow of blood through them. Why does this matter? This can be a serious problem which can cause blood clots to form and completely block the flow of blood, leading to much serious issues such as heart attacks or strokes. One of those more serious issues is what we know as a heart attack. Unfortunately, not everyone knows that they are having a heart attack, or even what the signs and symptoms of one are. This is a major issue that is working on being addressed as we deal with this disease. Heart attacks are the most dangerous, and once you have one, you're more prone to getting them in the future. The reason for this is because with a heart attack, your heart becomes damaged. And like any other organ, once damaged, it is easier for it to become damaged in the future. Some important things with heart attacks is more education with the public, exercising regularly, having a healthy diet, and going to the doctor. Another serious issue with cardiovascular disease is a stroke. Unlike with heart attacks that can often go unnoticed, a stroke is a lot more noticeable. Although, with that, they can be a lot more serious. The reason for this is because with a stroke, the blood supply is cut off from the brain and can cause severe damage, with causing the death of brain cells. Some important factors when considering a stroke is those that have high blood pressure, also known as hypertension, are more prone to strokes in the future. Okay, now let us look at some symptoms of heart disease in your blood vessels. Some classic signs and symptoms is chest pain, chest tightness, chest pressure, or chest discomfort, also known in the medical community as angina. Shortness of breath is another common symptom. Pain, numbness, weakness, or coldness in your legs or arms. If the blood vessels in those parts of your body have narrowed, along with pain in the neck, jaw, throat, upper abdomen, or back. These are just some common symptoms of heart disease in your blood vessels. And as you can see over here on the right hand side is a picture that basically details walking through what is happening. On this slide, I'm going to discuss some heart disease symptoms caused by heart defects. Start off talking about some serious symptoms and then go on to less serious symptoms. Mostly with heart defects, they'll be found early on in life, but for instance, some symptoms could be pale gray or blue skin, which is also called cyanosis. You can have swelling in the legs, abdomen, or area around the eyes. And in infants, you can have shortness of breath during feedings, which will lead to poor weight gain. Some less serious symptoms of heart defects is shortness of breath during exercise or activities, easily being tired during exercise or activities, and swelling in the hands, ankles, or feet, which is also known as edema. You may be asking yourself, why are heart defects important to consider during a slide deck presentation about cardiovascular disease? And that would be a good question to ask. The reason I included heart defects in the slide deck presentation about cardiovascular disease is because heart defects cause the heart to be more unstable and easily prone to damage thus leading in results such as heart attacks or cardiovascular disease later on in life. If you have an inkling to know more about heart effects, you can look under the website that I went to in the bibliography and research more on your own. There are three different categories that the World Health Organization breaks the risk factors for cardiovascular disease into. They are behavioral risk factors, which include unhealthy diets, physical inactivity, and the harmful use of alcohol and tobacco. Then they classify metabolic risk factors such as hypertension, diabetes, elevated blood lipids, and increased body weight. And then the last is other risk factors such as genetic predisposition, aging, poverty, low education status, and psychological status, which includes stress and depression. As we continue on in the slide deck presentation, I'm going to be going through each one of these individually and addressing certain aspects of those. First up is behavioral risk factors. So according to my extensive research that I've done, I found that high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and smoking are key heart disease and cardiovascular disease risk factors. About half of Americans have at least one of these three risk factors. So as you probably guessed, cigarette smoking is a major health hazard. It contributes to cardiovascular disease and death. Cigarette smoking plays a crucial role in all the phases of cardiovascular disease and acts as both a passive and active role and affects those that are predisposed to cardiovascular more in these events. So what does it do? Cigarette smoke increases inflammation, thrombosis, and oxidation cholesterol. New research data supports that cigarette smoke exposure increases the mechanism for initiating cardiovascular disease. Switching subjects a little, but not forgetting how important cigarette smoke is, we're going to discuss a little bit on diet and cardiovascular disease. So there are studies on animal models and humans that showed exposure to imbalanced nutrient supply in fetal life, deficient growth and gestational periods, or during infancy is associated with higher cardiovascular disease and deaths. An example of this is the Dutch famine, which lasted from 1944 to 1945. This case demonstrated with strong evidence that maternal nutrient deficiency was associated with epigenetic alterations and increased risk of chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease later in life. There have been multiple studies done recently with mice and diet and nutrition prenatal and during gestation. These studies have all concluded that nutrition during pregnancy is linked to cardiovascular disease. Although not as thought about in risk for cardiovascular disease, air pollution, although slight, plays a role in this disease as well. Like cigarette smoke, other such pollutants can be breathed in and affect the body. Also like cigarette smoke, this is a combination effect. Some examples of air pollutants are smoke from industrial factories, farms, and laboratory materials. Although not a huge issue, it is worth noting some environmental risk factors when considering cardiovascular disease. So here's a graph of heart disease death rates from 2011 to 2013. As you probably could have guessed, the South, and in particular the Central South, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama, have the highest rates of death in heart related diseases. Taking that into account, we're going to go into some other risk factors. So, for other risk factors, there's been a serious amount of research done on genetic and predisposition to cardiovascular disease. There has been a direct correlation between family history of cardiovascular disease and one's likelihood to develop that disease. The American Heart Association did a very interesting journal on this that can be found by going to the following link if you're so interested in learning more. Even with all this, genetic risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease still has a long way to go in its research and development. Some other risk factors. Another important thing to note with genetics is that which involves the diet talked about earlier in the presentation. It's also important to remember that not all people are the same, but from a scientific standpoint, they are. Research has concluded that those with nutrition deficits early in life are more prone to cardiovascular disease later in life. These are just all proven facts in the research that has been done so far. If you're interested in learning more, you can go to the following link that I've set up and click on that, go through it, and I'll give you some more information on risk factors in cardiovascular disease. So diabetes. Diabetes is an important risk factor to study when you're talking about heart attacks and strokes, cardiovascular diseases. People with diabetes are about 2 to 4 times more likely to have a heart attack or a stroke than those without diabetes. If you're not familiar with what diabetes is, it's a condition where there's too much glucose in the blood. So basically, the problem with diabetes is it speeds up the effects of heart disease. So in people's arteries with diabetes, the plaque builds up faster than it would in normal people. Some important factors to consider is you can have diabetes without knowing it. So it's good to go and get checked up often. Make sure that you don't smoke, lose weight, eat healthy, take your medications that are prescribed to you, and have a active lifestyle. Okay, so what should you have learned from this presentation? Some important factors on this slide. If you've had a heart attack, your heart may be damaged. This can affect your heart's rhythm, pumping action, and blood circulation. If you've had one heart attack, you're more prone to having another heart attack later in life. Another important thing, eating a healthier diet, increasing physical activity, quitting smoking, and managing stress, in addition to, like I said before, taking the prescribed medications can help you reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease. So what I think is important, according to all the research I've done, gene on gene and gene on environment interactions might produce a meaningful improvement in qualification of the genetic determinants of cardiovascular disease. With that being said, It is safe to say that testing for gene on gene and gene on environment interactions is a new front and will be explored more thoroughly in the decades to come. I feel like there needs to be an important presence and emphasis on this research in particular. Okay, so if you're just waking up from a nap, you slept through this entire presentation, I know it happens. I can be boring sometimes. Here's the key points to take away. If you learn anything today, read this slide. So what you need to know is there needs to be more research done when it comes to cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease affects everyone equally. Everyone is at risk for cardiovascular disease. Some people might be predisposed to cardiovascular disease over others, but everyone can get it. Cardiovascular disease is a leading cause of death in the world. Education and personal care is important to understanding and treating cardiovascular disease. More work needs to go into gene research when it comes to cardiovascular disease. And lastly, cardiovascular disease is a lifelong problem that doesn't go away. Okay, so here's a list of my references. I found these references to be very helpful in doing this slide deck presentation. If you are interested in my slide deck presentation at all, I encourage you to look at these references for yourself. Some of them are very interesting reads, more so than others. And in particular, I found that the resources titled Genes, Environment, and Cardiovascular Disease, Gene Diet Interactions in Cardiovascular Disease, and Gene Environment Interactions in Cardiovascular Disease to be the most helpful when doing this slide deck presentation. I hope that you take some time to look at these references and enjoy them as much as I have. All right, the slide everyone's been waiting for, the question slide. So this is the time. If you have any questions during this slide deck presentation, write them down. I will be giving you out my contact information on the following slide. Feel free to shoot me an email. We can discuss whatever the questions that you have about the slide deck presentation. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation as much as I did presenting it. So, as said in the previous slide, this is my contact information, email address, phone number. Contact me for more information with any questions you have or for more resources. Hope you enjoyed my presentation and have a good day.